Dr. Carson, thanks for joining me on Afterwards.
It's my pleasure.
Your book, Martin's Dream, is a memoir and a history book. In the book, you talk about your personal journey, and you're very candid about your life. And you also cover new insights as a historian to the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What prompted you to write the book this way?
Well, I wanted to write something to mark the 50th anniversary, and I realized that this is 50 years of my life, that it's King's legacy and his life coincides with my coming of age. Mm-hmm. So part of it was to do those two tasks. I felt that my life had been connected to the King legacy, and yet I felt that there was something about my life that needed to be told in order to understand how King impacted me, and how I got involved in this amazing journey of editing King's papers.
Well, it's an excellent read, and you and I are of the same generation, and I too was coming of age in the 60s. And the book, I must say, was bittersweet for me because, I guess sweet because I knew Dr. King. He was my mentor. I knew him the last 2 years of his life. And bitter because of the way he was taken from us, because of racial hatred in this country. And I don't know, I guess we can start at the beginning, because at the beginning of your book, you're on the Mall with Dr. King. And near the end of your book, you're on the Mall again, 50 years later, with his monument, which you helped to design.
And in between, coming back so many times on important occasions to the Mall. So it seems like even though I only lived in Washington for a short time, the Mall seemed to be a place that had such great symbolic meaning for my life.
And sentimental.
And sentimental, yes.
As well.
Every time I come back, I have all these memories.
It's a beautiful city. You were 19 years old in 1963. You were on the Mall, the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave that iconic address, I Have a Dream. How did you happen to go there?
Well, part of it is that I grew up in a small town where there weren't very many black people. I think there were 3 black families growing up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And so I'd always been fascinated by what was the black community like. You know, I didn't have very much exposure to it, except on visits to my relatives in Detroit. So I think I learned about the black community through the black freedom struggle. I'd pick up my newspaper, and there was Martin Luther King, there are the Little Rock Nine, there are the students in the sit-ins, and they became my role models. So by 1963, I'm in college. I get to go to this student meeting, National Student Association meeting in Indianapolis,
which is my hometown, by the way.
At Bloomington, actually, and I meet Stokely Carmichael, and you know, he's the first person in SNCC I talked to, and I remember when I told him that I wanted to go to the march, and he just kind of dismissed that, and you know, how could you think about just going to that picnic?
Why? Was he a detractor of Dr. King or his methods?
Not so much. You know, he didn't say that in terms of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was just one of the people who were going to be at the march. I think it was just that for me, he felt that I should be in Albany, Georgia, and Cambridge, Maryland, and you know, he was at Howard University at the time, so he would be going to these places where there's activism
and danger.
So going to a one-day march just was not what he had in mind, and I think he was trying to recruit me into the movement. But for me, going to a one-day march would be the most exciting and radical thing I had done in my life at that point.
I want to talk more about Stokely, but let's go back to the march. To be there when he gives that address, what did you think of the speech? Did you think it would be iconic like the Gettysburg Address or FDR's Day of Infamy?
Oh, no, not at that point. I mean, for those of us who were there, it was the final speech in a long day of speeches. So, yes, I was very pleased to see Martin Luther King in person. I had heard about him, and everyone kind of looked forward to, well, what was going to Martin Luther King say, because he was already then known as this great orator. But his speech was very short. It wasn't one of his, long-winded, often he spoke for an hour or so.
Typically Baptist preacher.
And this is 15, 16 minutes. And it actually was planned to be less. It was planned to be about 7, 8 minutes. That was what he actually wrote out his speech
To be.
It was
Why was it longer? Did he decide to add the tell that story?
Well, one of the things I found out later, but I didn't know then, was that when he got to the end of his prepared remarks, he thought, oh, this occasion requires something more. He had kind of laid out his agenda, and now I can look at his advanced text and see he reaches the end and he's talking about go back to the South, go back to all these places, continue the protest. But then he thought the occasion required something more.
More gravitas.
And he had been talking about this dream that he had had. He had talked about it for years, the American dream, and then it had become his dream. And he had been in Detroit just a few months before, and he had talked about, I have a dream, and that America will someday realize these principles in the Declaration of Independence. So I think he was just inspired by that moment.
In our group, there was talk that Mahalia Jackson, who was there, was egging him on, saying,
Tell him about your dream. Yes. But, one of the things I found, I've listened to lots of recordings of that speech. I've never quite heard that. Now, maybe she kind of allowed stage whisper to him, that I want to believe that story because it just sounds so
She
great.
loved him.
Yes, she
The
did.
reason I
Yes.
met Dr. King is because I was staying at her home in Chicago as a young girl when I was working for Ebony Magazine. And Dr. King would come by there. As a matter of fact, I met him the day after he was hit in the head at Gage Park. Remember
Yes,
the
that's
story? You
right.
talk about it in the book about his being hit in the head at Gage Park in Cicero, Illinois. Did you meet him? Did you meet Dr. King?
I only saw him from a distance. He was
How
always...
close were you?
Well, I tried to get as close as I could, but, so I got to the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, but the notion as a 19-year-old that I would actually even shake hands with him, that would have been the thrill of my life. I only saw him speak twice, and both times I just saw him as a member of a crowd.
Where else did you see?
He came to UCLA when I was a student there and spoke, and so that was the other time. It was maybe 1965, something like that.
How did that impact you on the way home? You had this long journey on the way home. It was,
yes, I didn't have a
you were
ride.
brave.
A ride back. I didn't tell my parents I was coming, and I had a bus ticket that only went back to Indianapolis, and so then I just had to hitchhike, and I hitchhiked across the country.
Were you scared?
Of course, I mean, but as a 19-year-old, you think you can do everything.
You think you're invincible?
Yes, right. And
How did hearing Dr. King's speech that day impact you on how Stokely was trying to influence you? Did you, because you talked to Stokely afterwards?
yeah, well, no, before.
Did you talk to him again?
Not afterwards. It was probably 3 years before I talked with him again. By that time, he had become, in 1963, he was not a well-known public figure. 1966, he's the advocate of Black power, and so that's when the next time we got back in touch with each other again. And from that point on, I kind of stayed in touch with him for the rest of his life.
We want to talk about him some more, because Stokely Carmichael was one of my heroes, as well as Malcolm X. I was more in agreement with the Malcolm X, the later Malcolm X, and Stokely Carmichael than I was with Dr. King, despite knowing him. And later, as I've gotten older, I appreciate Dr. King's tactics. He is the one with the monument on the mall.
Yes.
But during that time, you had some misgivings about Time magazine naming Dr. King Man of the Year. What was?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, I was from a distance very proud of Martin Luther King, but I think I kind of absorbed a lot of SNCC's resentment of him. That the people in SNCC and I kind of felt this way. Martin Luther King is following us. We're not following him. He's the one who you know, we're out there trying to break new ground in terms of